Hey guys, what made 1950s suburbia so alluring was also what made it quietly difficult to live inside. From a distance, it looked like a triumph of order, comfort, and prosperity. But for many of the people who moved into those new neighborhoods, the neat lawns and bright kitchens concealed a world that could feel surprisingly narrow, watchful, and emotionally demanding. Where are you watching from tonight, and what history topic would you like me to explore next? If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if calm, quietly fascinating history is your kind of thing, subscribe for more. To understand the darker side of 1950s suburbia, it helps to begin not with the lawn itself or the garage or the polished dining table, but with the anxiety that stood just behind them. The familiar image of post-war suburbia is so strong that it can feel almost natural. The detached house, the smiling family, the dependable father commuting into the city, the mother in a clean apron, the children playing safely on a quiet street. In popular memory, especially in the United States, this became one of the defining pictures of the decade. It suggested arrival, stability, a life that had finally become modern, safe, and well-managed after depression, war, and rationing. But that image was not simply a neutral description of how people lived. It was also an aspiration, and in many cases a demand. It told Americans not just where to live, but how to live, what success looked like, what a family should resemble, how a neighborhood should appear, and what kinds of differences were to be kept out of view. That is part of what gives the subject its darker edge. The problem was not that suburbia was entirely false. Many families did experience it as a genuine improvement. The problem was that the promise came attached to pressures, exclusions, and forms of quiet strain that are easy to miss if we only look at the advertising. And the advertising mattered. By the 1950s, large-scale suburban development was not simply the result of private desire bubbling up from millions of households. It was helped along by public policy, mortgage systems, road building, and a wider post-war culture that encouraged families to see private domestic life as both a reward and a civic duty. After the dislocations of the 1930s and 1940s, the suburban house seemed to offer a release from uncertainty. It offered space, new appliances, modern plumbing, and a visible separation from the crowded industrial city. For many white working and middle-class families, this could indeed mean cleaner surroundings, safer streets, and a home they never imagined their parents would own. Yet that is exactly why the story has to be handled carefully. The darker side of suburbia was not hidden because nothing was there. It was hidden because the benefits were real enough to make criticism feel ungrateful, even disloyal. To question suburban life in the 1950s could sound like questioning prosperity itself. But once you look closer, the neatness begins to reveal its cost. One of the first things worth noticing is how much conformity was built into these communities. Entire developments appeared quickly, with rows of similar houses, repeated floor plans, similar setbacks, similar lawns, similar expectations. In one sense, this uniformity was practical. It lowered costs and made mass homeownership possible. But in another sense, it produced a social environment in which appearance mattered intensely. A house was not just a shelter. It was a statement about belonging. Curtains, lawns, paint, children's behavior, the timing of chores, the condition of the driveway, the kind of guests you entertained, even the volume of private difficulties within the home, all of it became part of a visible social performance. That performance was exhausting for some families. The suburb promised privacy, yet often created a different kind of exposure. In dense city neighborhoods, people certainly watched one another, but post-war suburbs introduced a peculiar blend of isolation and surveillance. Houses were separate, but not truly detached from judgment. Front yards were open stages. Streets were quiet enough that deviations stood out. If the ideal family was meant to be cheerful, clean, disciplined, and respectable, then sadness, conflict, eccentricity, financial trouble, alcoholism, marital resentment, or simple difference had to be managed carefully, often behind closed doors. And this is where the story becomes more emotionally complex than the nostalgic version allows. The suburban home was advertised as a refuge, but for many women especially, it could become a place of relentless responsibility and loneliness. This does not mean every suburban housewife was miserable, nor that urban women had somehow been free. But the 1950s suburban model often intensified domestic isolation. Daily life could become centered on childcare, housework, shopping, cooking, cleaning, and emotional management, all in a landscape physically separated from workplaces and public life. The modern home was full of labor-saving devices, but those devices did not necessarily produce freedom. They often raised standards instead. Cleanliness had to be more complete. Meals had to be more polished. Children had to be better supervised. The home itself became a kind of full-time project. There was a quiet irony in this. The suburban house was sold as a machine for easier living, yet it often expanded the burden of maintaining the ideal life inside it. A larger home meant more rooms to clean. New consumer goods required upkeep. Entertaining had its own rules. Mothers were expected not only to manage the household, but to embody emotional warmth, sexual respectability, child development expertise, and social grace. Much of this labor was invisible because it was described as natural femininity rather than work. At the same time, men were not exactly free inside this system either. The suburban husband was bound to another ideal: steady income, discipline, authority, restraint, and visible success. He was meant to provide the house, the car, the appliances, the television, the children's future. If he disliked his commute, found his work deadening, felt trapped by debt, or experienced the suburban script as a narrowing of his own life, there were not many respectable ways to say so. Post-war masculinity rewarded reliability, not introspection. Many men lived within a role that promised dignity but also demanded emotional silence. That silence mattered because the suburban order depended on it. A neighborhood built around visible stability often had limited room for public acknowledgement of distress. Mental health struggles, marital dissatisfaction, domestic abuse, addiction, sexual unhappiness, boredom, and loneliness did not disappear in suburbia. They were simply harder to fit into the ideal story the neighborhood told about itself. And then there was the matter of who was allowed into that story at all. This is one of the clearest places where the darker side of 1950s suburbia stops being subtle and becomes structural. Many suburban developments were not merely socially exclusive in an informal sense. They were shaped by discriminatory lending practices, racial covenants, zoning choices, and public policy frameworks that favored white families while excluding many Black Americans and other minorities from the same opportunities. The suburban dream was, in many places, built as a segregated dream. This is crucial because it changes how we understand the calmness of suburban life. The orderliness was not just produced by good planning and happy families. It was also produced by boundaries, legal, economic, and racial. Some neighborhoods were made quiet by design, and part of that design involved deciding who would not live there. Homeownership became a path to intergenerational wealth for millions, but access to that wealth was uneven from the beginning. So when later generations remembered the suburb as safe and stable, they were often remembering a system whose stability had been partly created through exclusion. Even class, which is sometimes softened in nostalgic accounts, had its own quiet tension. Not every suburban family was comfortably affluent. Many lived with careful budgets, installment payments, and the constant pressure to maintain appearances. The house might be new, but the mortgage was long. The car might gleam in the driveway, but one lost paycheck could change everything. Consumer abundance, so central to the image of the 1950s, often rested on debt and disciplined budgeting. The refrigerator, washing machine, and television set were signs of progress, but they were also reminders that the family had entered a system where success had to be continually displayed and financed. That helps explain why suburbia could feel both comforting and brittle. It offered predictability, but it was a predictability people had to keep earning. A missed payment, a public scandal, an unruly child, a husband who drank too much, a wife who seemed withdrawn, a teenager who did not fit the mold, a family whose race or religion marked them as different. These things could disturb the image very quickly. Beneath the polished surface, there was often a low hum of fear. Fear of slipping downward, fear of gossip, fear of failing at a role everyone else seemed to perform so easily. And of course, everyone else was not performing it easily. That may be one of the most important truths hidden inside the suburban ideal. Much of 1950s suburbia was sustained by mutual comparison and mutual concealment. People measured themselves against neighbors who were often doing the same thing. The result was not always open oppression or dramatic misery. Quite often it was something quieter and, in a way, harder to describe. A persistent feeling of being watched by standards that no one had fully chosen, but many had accepted. Children, too, were shaped by this environment in ways that later memory sometimes smooths over. The suburb could offer safety, green space, and play, yes, but it could also be an early training ground in conformity. Gender roles were modeled constantly. Respectability was visible everywhere. Popularity, normality, and family reputation were not abstract ideas. They were built into the street itself, into who invited whom over, whose mother seemed composed, whose father held the right job, whose lawn looked best, whose child had begun to drift toward trouble. And trouble did exist. Juvenile delinquency became one of the decade's recurring anxieties precisely because suburban comfort did not eliminate adolescent frustration. In some ways it sharpened it. A world of routine, supervision, and polished expectation could produce rebellion of its own kind. The image of the content suburban teenager was no more complete than the image of the content suburban housewife. Both belong to a larger cultural script that left out much of what people actually felt. What makes this history so interesting is that the suburb was not simply a fraud, nor simply a trap. It was a real solution to certain post-war desires and a real source of private strain at the same time. That contradiction is why it still lingers so powerfully in cultural memory. People inherited both its benefits and its silences. The house on the quiet street was often a place of comfort. It was also, sometimes, a place where people learned how much of themselves had to be edited to remain believable inside the American dream. And once that dream had settled into daily routine, another question began to emerge, one that would become harder to ignore as the years went on. What happened when a life designed for security began to feel emotionally airless, especially for those expected to remain inside it the longest? What happened, for many of those women, was not always dramatic enough to look like a crisis from the outside. That was part of the problem. Life in the suburb could appear orderly, even enviable, while becoming inwardly repetitive in a way that was difficult to name without sounding ungrateful. A woman might have a new house, healthy children, modern appliances, and a husband with a respectable salary, and still find herself moving through the day with a quiet sense that every hour had already been planned for her. The work was constant, but it was rarely treated as work in the full sense. It was described as fulfillment, duty, instinct, or simple good fortune. That made dissatisfaction unusually hard to speak about. If a factory worker said he was tired, his labor was visible. If a clerk complained of monotony, his office at least counted as a place of employment. But the suburban homemaker was expected to locate meaning inside the domestic routine itself. If she found that routine lonely or mentally narrowing, the language available to her was limited. She could be described as nervous, overwrought, difficult, or insufficiently appreciative. The structure around her was rarely the first thing to be blamed. This is one reason the emotional history of suburbia matters so much. We can understand the roads, the mortgages, the construction boom, and the advertising campaigns, but unless we also understand the interior life of the people who were meant to inhabit that world, we miss much of what made the suburban ideal so fragile. A life built around comfort can still become suffocating if it leaves little room for complexity. In the 1950s, many women were encouraged to compress their ambitions into the home, even when their talents, education, or simple curiosity pushed in wider directions. Some had worked during the war or seen larger horizons during years of national emergency, only to find themselves folded back into a domestic script that treated private family life as the proper center of female adulthood. That script was presented as reassuring, even scientific. Popular magazines, advertisers, educators, clergy, and an expanding world of experts often reinforced the idea that a stable society depended on clearly differentiated roles. The husband's task was to provide, the wife's task was to nurture, and the home was to operate as a haven from the tension of the outside world. But a haven can become a kind of enclosure when one member of the family is expected to remain in it for most of the day. The new suburb, so carefully designed around private domestic life, could separate women not only from paid work but from older forms of everyday contact that had existed in denser neighborhoods. In city districts or small towns, domestic burdens could be heavy as well, but daily life often unfolded amid more visible street life, more incidental contact, and more mixed-age social worlds. The suburb often replaced that with distance, scheduled visits, and long stretches of quiet. Even the very architecture of the place could intensify this. The single-family house on its own plot promised dignity and independence, but it also scattered people. If a husband took the car to work, a wife without easy transportation might find herself physically confined to the immediate neighborhood. Shopping, errands, school schedules, and social calls all had to be organized around logistics that could turn a seemingly spacious life into a surprisingly small one. The modern home, rather than opening outward, sometimes folded daily experience inward until the kitchen, laundry area, and children's rooms became the main stage on which identity was supposed to flourish. And yet the culture surrounding suburbia kept insisting that this was precisely where modern happiness had been achieved. That insistence produced a subtle cruelty. It was not enough to perform the role. One was expected to enjoy it in the right way. If a woman felt tired, irritable, bored, resentful, or vaguely empty, then the problem could be presented as personal maladjustment rather than social design. She might be told to organize her day better, improve her attitude, beautify herself, develop more charm, or recommit herself to the emotional needs of the family. A husband's frustration, too, might be treated as an individual failure of nerve or gratitude. The suburban ideal was so polished that it often transformed structural tension into private self-doubt. That self-doubt became part of the emotional economy of the decade. Quietly, the post-war home produced not just meals, laundry, and children, but reassurance. Someone had to absorb the anxieties of a society living under the shadow of the Cold War, nuclear fear, rapid consumer change, and social competition. The suburban wife was often expected to do a great deal of that absorbing. She was meant to make the home feel secure, modern, cheerful, and emotionally coherent. She was asked, in effect, to convert the pressures of the age into calm domestic atmosphere. It was an immense assignment, and it rarely appeared in public language as an assignment at all. This helps explain why tranquilizers, sedatives, and the language of nerves became so woven into mid-century domestic life. Not every suburban woman used medication, and one should be careful not to flatten the decade into a single story of pharmaceutical escape. But the broader pattern matters. There was a growing tendency to medicalize distress that might also have been social, existential, or deeply tied to gendered expectations. If a person felt trapped inside a role that looked perfect on paper, it was easier for the culture to describe the symptom than to confront the script itself. The modern suburban household, in all its brightness, generated forms of strain that modern medicine was increasingly asked to soften. At the same time, neighborhood life could be both supportive and oppressive. Women's clubs, church groups, school associations, coffee mornings, bridge circles, and informal networks of exchange did create real community. People borrowed sugar, watched one another's children, brought casseroles after illness, and built sincere friendships. It would be wrong to imagine every suburban neighborhood as cold. But those same networks could also become systems of discipline. They carried information. They spread judgments. They rewarded proper performance. A woman who seemed too unhappy, too glamorous, too sexual, too intellectual, too withdrawn, too careless, or too different might quickly become a subject of concern. Concern in such settings could shade easily into control. There was also a moral geography to these neighborhoods. Respectability was mapped onto space itself. The good block, the right school, the proper church, the decent family, the maintained lawn, the acceptable habits of children, the correct forms of femininity and masculinity. These did not float abstractly above suburban life. They were anchored in where people lived and how they arranged their domestic worlds. Middle-class identity was not just owned. It was displayed. And because it was displayed, it had to be protected from contamination, embarrassment, and visible disorder. That need for protection shaped attitudes toward sexuality in especially revealing ways. The 1950s suburb is often remembered as sexually conservative, and in many respects it was. Public norms encouraged chastity before marriage, restraint within marriage, and strong disapproval of any sexuality that fell outside heterosexual domestic respectability. But like so many things in this period, repression did not eliminate desire. It reorganized it. Families were encouraged to present themselves as wholesome and morally sound, while a great deal of fear and suspicion circulated around any form of sexual behavior that seemed improper, excessive, or difficult to regulate. Teenage sexuality, homosexuality, adultery, divorce, and even marital dissatisfaction could all become sites of anxiety because they threatened not just personal morality but neighborhood stability. The suburb, in other words, did not simply house families. It housed an ideal of normality, and normality had borders. Those borders were defended not only through religion or etiquette, but through schools, youth culture, psychiatry, policing, and everyday gossip. A boy who did not perform masculinity convincingly enough, a girl who seemed too bold, a bachelor who stayed unmarried too long, a couple whose marriage seemed visibly strained. Such people could become reminders that the suburban world was more brittle than it looked. Children grew up inside that brittleness even when they could not yet name it. They learned to sense which topics were discussed openly and which were pushed back behind polite phrases. They learned that families could appear successful while carrying private unhappiness. They learned that adults often spoke about security while worrying constantly about decline. The suburb promised innocence, but innocence had to be managed. Television, comics, music, dating, drinking, juvenile crime, and the new visibility of youth culture all stirred fears that domestic order might be easier to advertise than to preserve. This is one reason the teenager became such a charged figure in the 1950s imagination. Adolescents occupied a peculiar place in suburban life. They were the children for whom the new environment was supposedly built, yet they also revealed its limits. They had more leisure, more consumer attention, and more cultural visibility than many previous generations, but they also faced a world of expectations that could feel intensely narrow. The same suburb that gave them bicycles, schools, lawns, and safety also gave them watchfulness, routine, and a powerful model of what adulthood was supposed to become. Some accepted that model. Others resisted it through style, music, humor, petty rebellion, or more serious forms of conflict. Here again, the darker side of suburbia lies partly in the gap between image and lived texture. The famous family-centered decade was full of families trying to manage pressure without naming it too directly. It was full of fathers who may have felt reduced to earnings and commuting, mothers who may have felt dissolved into service, children who may have sensed that success meant becoming legible to a script older than themselves. None of this means suburban life was only bleak. Many people built affectionate homes there. Many children remembered real comfort. Many neighborhoods did provide safety and companionship. But the warmth was rarely as uncomplicated as the nostalgia suggests. Race remained one of the deepest complications of all. Even as some suburban residents celebrated themselves as modern and forward-looking, their communities often rested on exclusion that was both deliberate and institutionally supported. Black families who sought homes in suburbs frequently encountered closed doors, inflated prices, intimidation, steering by real estate agents, or neighborhoods organized to preserve whiteness under the language of property values and community standards. This matters not only because it was unjust, but because it reveals how much the suburban ideal depended on drawing lines while pretending merely to protect order. The clean street and stable property value could sound innocent, but they were often defended through a politics of who counted as a desirable neighbor. Once you see that, the suburb begins to look less like a naturally harmonious environment and more like a carefully curated one. Its peace was selective. Its freedoms were unevenly distributed. Its comforts were linked to public choices that did not benefit everyone in the same way. The emotional burdens inside the home and the racial exclusions outside it were not separate stories. They were part of the same broader attempt to make post-war America feel legible, stable, and controlled. And for all that effort, control remained incomplete. By the late 1950s, small cracks in the suburban consensus were becoming harder to ignore. Some women were beginning to articulate a dissatisfaction that could not be reduced to nerves. Some young people were treating the polished world of their parents with irony rather than reverence. Popular culture, even when still outwardly conformist, was carrying more visible restlessness. Questions about civil rights, education, sexuality, and authority were not yet transforming suburban life everywhere, but they were beginning to gather force at the edges of the picture. That is often how historical change begins, not with the collapse of an old world, but with a change in how comfortably people can continue pretending that its promises are enough. In suburbia, the promise had been powerful because it offered release from earlier hardships. But once the new house became ordinary, once the appliances became routine, once the lawn had to be mowed again and the commute repeated again and the smiling dinner performed again, some of the deeper questions returned. What counted as a meaningful life? Who was being asked to sacrifice ambition for order? Who got to belong in this dream? What had been excluded so that calm could look effortless? These were not yet always spoken in public language. Often they appeared first as moods, irritations, cultural jokes, marital silences, adolescent mockery, a doctor's prescription, a newspaper anxiety, a neighborhood controversy over who might move in, what might be taught, or which behavior was becoming unacceptable to ignore. The suburb still looked stable. In some places it would continue to expand and prosper. But the emotional and moral certainty that had once surrounded it was beginning, very gently, to loosen. And that loosening would matter, because as the next decade approached, the very communities that had been built to embody post-war order were about to become places where its tensions could no longer stay so neatly hidden behind the curtains and trimmed hedges of the American dream. Those tensions did not arrive all at once, and they did not look revolutionary at first. Very often, they appeared as small embarrassments inside otherwise ordinary lives. A dinner table argument that seemed to be about a daughter staying out too late was also quietly about generational authority. A disagreement over whether a wife should return to part-time work after the children were older was also about the limits of the suburban domestic ideal. A neighborhood debate over a new apartment complex, a school boundary, or a family moving onto the wrong street was often about race and class, even when nobody chose to say so directly. This is one of the reasons the history of suburbia can feel so familiar to modern listeners. Its darker side was rarely theatrical. It lived in ordinary routines. It was embedded in mortgage applications, school meetings, shopping trips, parent-teacher conversations, church committees, and the silence between married people who had learned to perform contentment more easily than they could explain dissatisfaction. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, that silence was becoming harder to maintain. The language people used to describe suburbia was beginning to shift. It was still a place of aspiration, certainly, but it was also increasingly a subject of satire, unease, and social criticism. Novelists, journalists, sociologists, and filmmakers began to pay closer attention to the emotional flatness that could sit beneath domestic perfection. The phrase itself, keeping up appearances, captured something central. The suburb did not simply ask for success. It asked for visible success. The emotional labor of looking stable became one of its defining pressures. For women, this pressure often sharpened as children grew older. The early years of motherhood were physically consuming enough to leave little room for abstract dissatisfaction. But as routines settled and children became more independent, some women found themselves confronting a disorienting question. If their entire adult identity had been organized around supporting everyone else, what remained that belonged specifically to them? This was not merely personal confusion. It reflected a larger contradiction in post-war culture. Girls were often educated well enough to be intellectually ambitious, then guided toward lives in which ambition itself could seem suspect if it disrupted domestic harmony. Many women did not reject marriage or family. That is important to say clearly. The dissatisfaction that later became more visible was often not a rejection of love, motherhood, or home, but of the assumption that these should entirely contain female adulthood. A woman could love her children deeply and still feel that something in her own life had been placed permanently on hold. She could be grateful for security and still resent the narrowness of the script. The problem was not always misery. Sometimes it was simply the persistent feeling of becoming smaller than one's own mind. The culture around her often had remarkably poor tools for handling that feeling. Advice literature encouraged self-improvement within the domestic role rather than serious rethinking of the role itself. Beauty routines, better hosting, more organized kitchens, improved marital charm, more patient parenting. These were offered as solutions to emotional dissatisfaction that often had deeper structural roots. The assumption remained that fulfillment should be found inside the suburban home, and if it was not, then the woman herself required adjustment. This is part of why works of social criticism about domestic life struck such a nerve when they appeared. They gave language to people who had been living inside discomfort without a stable vocabulary for it. Suddenly, private unease could be recognized as something shared. That recognition did not instantly transform suburban life, but it altered the emotional map. Once people can name a condition, it becomes harder to treat it as a private failure. Men, meanwhile, were encountering their own quieter crisis of expectation. The suburban father was often imagined as the clear beneficiary of post-war prosperity. Stable job, family authority, property ownership, and the public dignity of provision. Yet the experience beneath that image could be far more ambivalent. Long commutes into expanding business districts, repetitive corporate hierarchies, and the sense of being valued primarily as an income source produced their own kind of fatigue. White-collar work, often idealized compared to manual labor, could feel strangely impersonal. A man might spend his day inside structures that demanded obedience and emotional restraint, then return home expected to embody calm authority and confidence. For some, The suburb became not a reward for work, but a visible reminder of how trapped work had made them feel. The mortgage that symbolized success also limited risk. Leaving an unsatisfying job became harder when the house, the car, the children's schooling, and the family's social standing all depended on continuity. Security itself could become a form of discipline. The suburban provider was admired, but he was also tethered. This is one reason why the decade's ideal of masculinity often contained such a strange tension between confidence and fragility. Publicly, men were expected to be stable and decisive. Privately, many navigated anxieties about status, income, sexual adequacy, emotional distance, and the fear of becoming ordinary in a culture increasingly built around consumption and comparison. Success had become measurable through visible goods, but visible goods were not especially good at answering private questions about meaning. Teenagers, watching all of this, developed their own relationship to suburban life. They were often the first generation to grow up entirely inside the post-war landscape rather than moving into it as adults. They did not remember the Depression in the same way. They had not built the neighborhood. They inherited it. And what they inherited was both privilege and confinement. The rise of youth culture in the 1950s and early 1960s was not simply about music or fashion. It reflected a deeper generational negotiation over identity. Teenagers were given unprecedented attention as consumers, but that did not necessarily translate into emotional freedom. They were still expected to move toward the same adult template: marriage, house, respectability, suburban stability. Their rebellion, when it came, often looked small on the surface. Hairstyles, records, cars, cigarettes, late nights. But these were symbols of something larger. They were ways of testing whether adulthood had to mean becoming a polished copy of the people already living on the street. The suburb's obsession with visibility made adolescent rebellion especially threatening. A troubled child was not only a family concern. It was a neighborhood event. Reputation mattered. Parents feared not only danger but embarrassment. Juvenile delinquency panics, so common in mid-century media, often said as much about adult insecurity as they did about teenage behavior. The clean suburban order was psychologically invested in the idea that proper environment produced proper children. When it did not, the entire logic felt unstable. Schools became one of the main stages on which these anxieties played out. Education was tied to upward mobility, moral development, and national competition, especially during the Cold War. A suburban school was not simply a place of learning. It was evidence that the neighborhood itself was succeeding. Conflicts over curriculum, discipline, religious values, race, and who belonged within a school district were therefore charged with larger meaning. A debate over textbooks could be a debate over the future of the American family. Religion also held a complicated place in this world. Church attendance increased in many suburban communities, and religious life often functioned as both sincere faith and social architecture. Congregations offered belonging, moral legitimacy, childcare networks, and a shared language of family respectability. Yet religion could also reinforce the very expectations that made suburban life difficult to question. Sermons and church culture often strengthened ideals of marriage, gender hierarchy, and domestic duty. To challenge the suburban family model could therefore feel not only socially awkward but spiritually suspect. Even leisure carried pressure. Barbecues, neighborhood parties, holiday gatherings, summer vacations. These were meant to display ease and abundance, but they also required performance. Hospitality became another form of competence. The right food, the right furniture, the right family atmosphere, the right evidence that one was managing life properly. Consumer culture did not remain outside the home. It entered the living room and made itself part of intimacy. Televisions, kitchen design, children's toys, cars in the driveway. These were not just objects. They were proofs. And proof was always needed because the dream itself remained slightly unstable. The suburb was built on optimism, but also on fear of losing what had been gained. That fear could turn neighbors into subtle competitors. People compared lawns, grades, promotions, children's manners, wives' appearances, husbands' salaries, even the cleanliness of windows. Few people would admit to living this way explicitly, yet comparison was woven into the environment. Stability depended partly on believing one was still moving upward. This is where suburban life begins to connect directly to the larger politics of the era. Cold War America encouraged private domestic order as a symbol of national strength. The good family in the good house on the good street became part of a moral contrast with imagined disorder elsewhere, urban decline, political radicalism, foreign ideological threats. Domestic normality was not merely personal preference. It was linked to citizenship. To live correctly was, in a sense, to participate in a vision of American stability. That made deviation more charged. Divorce, visible poverty, interracial integration, sexual nonconformity, intellectual dissent. These could be interpreted not just as personal choices but as threats to a social order that had been made to feel patriotic. The suburb did not invent these anxieties, but it gave them a highly visible stage. Every front porch became part of a national story about what kind of country America believed itself to be. Yet the contradictions kept accumulating. The same nation presenting itself as domestically secure was confronting the civil rights movement, school desegregation battles, and increasingly visible criticism of racial exclusion. Suburbs that had once relied on quiet mechanisms of segregation found themselves facing louder questions. Who had been kept out and at what cost? Could prosperity still be described as innocent when its geography had been so carefully managed? Resistance to change often came wrapped in the language of property values, neighborhood character, or concern for children. That language sounded neutral, even practical, but it often protected older hierarchies. A family objecting to integration might describe themselves not as racist, but as defenders of stability. This was one of suburbia's most powerful disguises. It allowed deeply political choices to present themselves as ordinary domestic caution. And still, beneath all of this, daily life continued. Children went to school. Fathers took trains and highways into the city. Mothers planned dinners, folded laundry, hosted birthdays, and made phone calls across kitchen counters. The extraordinary thing about the suburban order was how ordinary it looked while carrying so much historical weight. It was not a palace, not a battlefield, not a parliament. It was a split-level house with a driveway. Yet inside that house were negotiations about race, gender, labor, intimacy, class, and national identity. This is why nostalgia can be so misleading. People often remember the suburb through childhood impressions. Safety, bicycles, television light in the evening, familiar streets, mothers calling children home at dusk. Those memories can be real and still incomplete. Children often remember comfort because adults worked hard to preserve it. The darker side of suburbia was frequently hidden precisely so that childhood could feel simple. But historical understanding asks us to look at what made that simplicity possible, and who paid for it. By the early 1960s, the first confident language of post-war certainty was beginning to thin. Not vanish, but thin. The house remained standing. The lawns were still trimmed. But more people were starting to ask whether neatness was the same thing as happiness, whether safety was the same thing as freedom, and whether the suburban promise had quietly demanded too much silence from the people living inside it. Those questions would only grow sharper as the decade moved forward, because once the ideal life becomes open to inspection, every ordinary room in the suburban house begins to look slightly different. Especially the bedroom, where private marriages carried burdens that the bright public image of the American family could no longer completely hide. Especially the bedroom, Because marriage in 1950s suburbia was not simply a private emotional relationship. It was one of the central institutions holding the entire suburban ideal together. The house, the mortgage, the children, the neighborhood reputation, the visible performance of stability. All of it depended heavily on the assumption that marriage itself was secure, orderly, and fundamentally unquestioned. To examine what happened behind that bedroom door is to understand how much of suburban life rested on emotional arrangements that were often far less peaceful than the public image suggested. The popular story of the decade presented marriage as both destiny and reward. Young adults were encouraged to marry earlier than many generations before them. Marriage was not treated as one possible path among many, but as the obvious arrival point of respectable adulthood. A successful woman was expected to become a wife and mother. A successful man was expected to become a husband and provider. Remaining unmarried too long could create suspicion, pity, or subtle social exclusion. Marriage offered legitimacy. It made one legible to the neighborhood. But when an institution becomes this central, it also becomes difficult to question honestly. Many couples entered marriage with genuine affection and hope, yet they also entered it carrying immense cultural expectations. They were not simply trying to love one another. They were trying to perform an entire social ideal. The suburban marriage had to look right. It had to reassure parents, neighbors, churches, schools, and, in a broader symbolic sense, the nation itself. That pressure shaped intimacy in ways that were often invisible from the outside. A husband might believe his role was to protect his family from economic instability, but in practice that could translate into emotional distance, long work hours, and a relationship to home that revolved more around responsibility than presence. A wife might be expected to create warmth and emotional continuity, but that expectation could turn her into the household's permanent manager of moods, conflicts, and unspoken tensions. The marriage worked, in part, because someone kept absorbing discomfort before it became visible. And discomfort was common. The idea that the 1950s represented an era of uncomplicated domestic harmony depends largely on how much private unhappiness is excluded from the picture. Marital resentment, sexual frustration, boredom, infidelity, alcoholism, financial anxiety, and emotional loneliness existed in suburbia just as they existed elsewhere. What made them distinctive was the difficulty of acknowledging them inside a culture that treated the suburban family as proof of success. Divorce, for example, was far less common than it would later become, but lower divorce rates do not automatically indicate greater marital happiness. In many cases, they reflected stronger stigma, fewer economic options for women, religious pressure, concern for children's reputations, and the simple fact that leaving a marriage could mean social and financial collapse. A woman who depended economically on her husband might remain in an unhappy or even frightening household because the alternatives were narrower than modern audiences often assume. A man, too, might remain inside a deeply unsatisfying marriage because divorce threatened not only family life but status, respectability, and his own sense of masculine competence. This is where the polished image of suburban domesticity becomes particularly misleading. Stability could be real, but it could also be maintained through endurance rather than contentment. People stayed because leaving was costly. They learned to live beside disappointment because the surrounding culture offered few legitimate scripts for reinvention. A marriage did not have to feel joyful to remain permanent. Sexual expectations inside marriage were equally shaped by contradiction. The decade outwardly celebrated family values and moral restraint, yet marriage itself was expected to provide not just companionship but emotional and sexual completeness. Women were often asked to embody both purity and desirability, modesty and availability, maternal devotion and romantic charm. Men were expected to be strong but controlled, authoritative but tender enough to sustain family intimacy. These were not simple roles to inhabit, especially in a culture where frank conversation about sexuality remained limited and embarrassment often replaced clarity. Many couples entered adulthood with surprisingly little practical language for intimacy. Public morality emphasized restraint, while advertising and popular culture increasingly hinted at glamour and desire. The result could be confusion more than confidence. Marital sex was treated as central and yet often discussed in coded, embarrassed terms. If something felt unsatisfying, the problem was likely to remain private. The suburban home was supposed to be sexually respectable, and respectability had a habit of turning silence into virtue. Infidelity, unsurprisingly, did not disappear under these conditions. Affairs existed across class lines and across the neat boundaries of suburban morality, though they were often hidden behind extraordinary discretion. The suburb, with its emphasis on appearances, could be strangely well suited to secrecy. Affairs were dangerous not only because they threatened emotional bonds, but because they endangered the public narrative of family order. A scandal was not just personal humiliation. It could destabilize an entire social position. Alcohol often moved through this world in similarly quiet ways. The evening drink, the polished home bar, the cocktail party, these were ordinary features of suburban adult life, especially in middle-class settings. But for some households, alcohol functioned less as leisure and more as anesthesia. Men returned from work exhausted and emotionally inaccessible. Women found themselves drinking against monotony or loneliness. Yet heavy drinking could remain hidden longer in a culture where maintaining appearances was a practiced skill. The dinner still happened. The lawn was still cut. The children still went to school. Children, of course, were often far more aware of household strain than adults like to imagine. They noticed tone before they understood content. They learned which subjects caused silence, which evenings felt tense, which parent drank too much, which door closed too hard, which apologies never arrived. One of suburbia's quiet truths is that children were often raised inside performances of normality while privately sensing how fragile that normality could be. And because suburban neighborhoods were built around visibility, parents frequently experienced their children as extensions of family reputation. A child's behavior reflected on the household. Academic success, politeness, dating choices, friendships, even clothing could become charged with symbolic importance. Parenting was not only about affection or discipline, it was also about managing the family's place within the moral geography of the neighborhood. This pressure intensified around daughters in particular. Teenage girls were often treated as bearers of family respectability in highly specific ways. Sexual reputation mattered enormously. Dating was monitored not simply because of concern for safety, but because female behavior carried social consequences for the entire household. A pregnancy, a visible romance considered inappropriate, a refusal to move toward conventional femininity, these could all become sources of intense anxiety because they threatened the suburban family's public coherence. Sons faced different but equally rigid expectations. They were expected to move toward competent masculinity. Ambition, athletic confidence, heterosexual certainty, emotional restraint, and eventual economic provision. Boys who seemed too sensitive, too artistic, too uninterested in conventional masculine competition, or too visibly different could find themselves subtly marked. The suburb's promise of normality required constant policing of what counted as normal. This policing extended into the medical and psychological language of the time. Psychiatry and psychology were becoming more visible in post-war American life, but they often operated inside the same cultural assumptions rather than outside them. A child who did not fit expected patterns might be treated less as a person with a different temperament and more as a problem requiring correction. A wife who seemed persistently unhappy might be pathologized rather than listened to. A husband struggling with emotional emptiness might be encouraged to restore authority rather than question the structure of his life. Normality itself became a kind of prescription. The goal was not always happiness in the richest sense, but adjustment, successful adaptation to the suburban family model. This is one reason so much mid-century advice sounds strangely managerial. Marriage had to be managed. Children had to be managed. Desire had to be managed. Anxiety had to be managed. The household was imagined almost like a small institution whose efficiency reflected moral worth. Yet institutions create resistance. Some people complied outwardly while building private lives that did not fit the official script. Some women formed deep friendships that became emotional lifelines outside marriage. Some men cultivated quiet parallel worlds of work, hobbies, or emotional withdrawal. Some teenagers created entire identities in cars, diners, school corridors, and music scenes far removed from parental supervision. The suburb looked uniform partly because so much difference had learned to survive discreetly. Homosexuality reveals this especially clearly. In 1950s suburbia, gay men and lesbians often lived under intense pressure to remain invisible. The suburban family model was so firmly heterosexual that deviation could threaten employment, housing, custody, and basic safety. Some married in attempts to conform. Some lived double lives. Some disappeared socially into the role expected of them because there seemed to be no viable alternative. The emotional cost of this invisibility rarely appears in nostalgic accounts of the decade, yet it was part of the same larger system that made conformity feel necessary for everyone. Even friendship between adults was shaped by the suburban structure. Men's friendships were often mediated by work or neighborhood ritual rather than deep emotional disclosure. Women's friendships could be intimate but were also shaped by competitive domestic expectations. Loneliness could therefore exist inside full neighborhoods. One could be surrounded by people and still feel privately unrecognized. The suburb produced proximity, but not always understanding. This becomes clearer when we look at illness, grief, or failure. A serious illness, a lost job, a child in trouble, infertility, depression, miscarriage. These moments tested the suburban ideal because they could not easily be decorated into cheerful domestic competence. Some communities responded with genuine generosity. Others responded with awkward distance, as though suffering itself threatened the collective story. The polished neighborhood was comfortable with casseroles, but less comfortable with long-term disruption. Perhaps the deepest contradiction of suburban marriage was that it promised intimacy while often rewarding emotional concealment. To keep the peace, people learned which truths to soften, which frustrations to redirect, which disappointments to rename as maturity. Love certainly existed, but so did habit, dependency, fear, pride, and exhaustion. The house held all of it at once. And as the 1960s moved closer, those private tensions began connecting more visibly to public change. A woman dissatisfied with domestic confinement was no longer only a private case. She was becoming part of a broader conversation about gender and freedom. A teenager questioning inherited moral certainty was becoming part of a generational shift. A family confronting integration on their street was participating in the civil rights struggle, whether they wanted to think of it that way or not. The suburban bedroom, in other words, was never only a bedroom. It was connected to politics, economics, race, education, religion, and national identity. The quiet arguments over money, sex, ambition, and fairness were not separate from the history of post-war America. They were one of the places where that history was lived most intensely. And nowhere would that become clearer than in the growing question of women's work. Because once the suburban wife began asking whether the home was enough, the entire architecture of the post-war dream had to confront a possibility it had tried very hard to keep at the edge of the lawn. What if fulfillment required a life larger than the house itself? What if fulfillment required a life larger than the house itself? That question, once it began to take shape, was more disruptive than it first appeared. It did not simply challenge household routines. It challenged one of the moral foundations of post-war suburbia, the belief that a woman's highest stability, and perhaps her highest virtue, was to make the private home her complete world. For many suburban families, women had always worked in one form or another. Paid labor did not disappear in the 1950s, and it would be inaccurate to imagine every wife permanently confined to domestic life. Working-class women, black women, immigrant women, widows, divorced women, and many others had long histories of balancing wage labor with family responsibility. But the suburban ideal that dominated middle-class imagination treated the full-time homemaker as the model of success. A husband earning enough to support a wife and children in a detached home was not merely a financial arrangement. It was a public symbol that the family had made it. This is why a wife returning to work could carry emotional meaning far beyond the paycheck. On the practical level, many families needed the income. Mortgages, appliances, car payments, children's schooling, medical costs, and the ordinary expense of maintaining suburban respectability could strain even a seemingly comfortable household. The image of effortless prosperity often concealed careful budgeting and quiet anxiety. A second income could mean relief, but socially it could also raise uncomfortable questions. Was the husband failing as provider? Was the wife insufficiently devoted to the home? Was ambition being mistaken for selfishness? The answers depended heavily on class, race, religion, and region, but the underlying tension remained familiar. The suburban system wanted women's labor inside the house to feel invisible enough to count as love, and women's labor outside the house to remain secondary enough not to threaten the symbolic order. A woman could help financially, but ideally without disrupting the emotional architecture that placed the home at the center of her identity. This balancing act produced its own quiet exhaustion. A woman who worked outside the home rarely ceased to be responsible for what happened inside it. The second shift, though not always named that way at the time, was already present. Employment did not erase expectations around cooking, cleaning, childcare, emotional management, school events, birthdays, church obligations, or the endless small acts that kept the family functioning. Instead, many women found themselves performing both worlds at once, while still being measured against the ideal of effortless domestic grace. Even women who did not return to formal employment often pursued a wider life through volunteer work, community organizing, school boards, libraries, church leadership, political groups, and informal intellectual networks. These spaces mattered because they created forms of public competence that the domestic role alone could not always satisfy. Running a charity drive, organizing civic projects, managing educational committees, these were not trivial activities. They were often places where women exercised authority, negotiation, and strategic intelligence, even if the culture insisted on describing them as extensions of feminine helpfulness rather than power. There is a subtle irony here. The same suburban structure that attempted to narrow women's lives also created concentrated communities in which women could build networks of influence. The school fundraiser, the neighborhood association, the church committee, these were not revolutions, but they were spaces where private domestic labor began shading into public civic presence. Many later political and social movements would grow, in part, from women who had first learned organizational authority in exactly these environments. At the same time, dissatisfaction was increasingly entering public conversation through writing. Popular books, magazine essays, and journalistic investigations began giving shape to a diffuse feeling many women had struggled to describe. The argument was not simply that suburbia was oppressive, but that the culture surrounding it had mistaken containment for fulfillment. Intelligence, ambition, and emotional complexity were being compressed into roles too narrow to hold them comfortably. This recognition did not arrive as a clean, universal awakening. Many women rejected such criticism, sincerely believing that domestic life was not a prison but a meaningful center. Others felt both things at once: pride in family life and resentment at its limits. Historical honesty requires holding both truths together. The problem was not that homemaking itself lacked dignity. The problem was that dignity was too often denied to any female life that did not fit the suburban domestic script. Men often reacted to these changes with uncertainty rather than simple opposition. Some husbands genuinely supported their wives' broader ambitions, especially when they could see the emotional stagnation domestic isolation produced. Others felt threatened, not always because they were cruel or consciously controlling, but because the provider role had been made central to their own identity. If a wife no longer seemed fully satisfied by dependence, what exactly did masculine success mean? If the home was no longer the unquestioned center of female adulthood, then the entire moral exchange of marriage required renegotiation. This renegotiation could be tender, but it could also be deeply painful. Many couples discovered that they had married under one set of assumptions and were now living under another. A husband who believed he was giving his family security might struggle to understand why that security did not feel sufficient. A wife asking for independence might be heard as rejecting love rather than asking for personhood. These were not always arguments with clear villains. Often they were collisions between sincere people and a social structure that had promised simplicity where none existed. Children observed these negotiations as well. They saw mothers returning to classes, taking jobs, becoming more visibly frustrated, or refusing to perform cheerful domesticity with the same certainty. They saw fathers reacting with pride, confusion, resentment, or relief. The family itself became a place where broader cultural transformation was rehearsed long before it appeared in formal politics. Work also connected suburban women to a changing public world. Offices, schools, hospitals, retail spaces, and universities brought them into contact with ideas and expectations that suburban domestic culture could no longer fully contain. The private home had always been tied to the larger economy, but once women moved more visibly across that boundary, the fiction that the suburb was a self-contained moral universe became harder to maintain. Education played an important role here. Post-war prosperity had expanded educational opportunities, and many women who had been encouraged to study seriously found it difficult to permanently accept a life in which their intellect was treated as decorative rather than central. Some had married young and left college unfinished. Others had completed degrees only to discover that education was admired more as polish than as preparation for authority. The frustration was not simply professional. It was existential. To be told that your deepest capacities were admirable but not necessary creates a very particular kind of loneliness. This loneliness often hid behind competence. The suburban wife who seemed most composed might also be the one most practiced at translating private dissatisfaction into flawless routine. The kitchen was clean. The children were dressed. The thank you notes were written. The neighbors admired the household. But competence could become a disguise that made unhappiness less visible rather than less real. There is also an important racial dimension here. The ideal of the suburban homemaker was deeply shaped by whiteness and class privilege. Many black women had never been offered the fantasy of complete domestic dependence because economic necessity and structural inequality demanded paid work. Domestic labor, childcare, and wage labor overlapped in different ways. This meant that critiques of suburban domestic confinement were experienced unevenly across American life. For some women, the problem was being trapped inside the house. For others, it was being excluded from the protections and wealth that suburban domestic respectability symbolized in the first place. This difference mattered politically. As civil rights struggles intensified, the suburban house itself became part of the national argument about who deserved security, dignity, and access to the future. A home was never just a home. It was equity, schooling, inheritance, neighborhood safety, and social legitimacy. The question of women's work was therefore tied not only to gender but to the larger question of whose domestic life the nation chose to protect. Suburban employers and institutions also reinforced the old order in quieter ways. Women returning to work were often directed toward occupations considered appropriately feminine: teaching, nursing, clerical work, retail, caregiving. These jobs could be meaningful and professionally serious, but they were also frequently underpaid and structured around the assumption that a woman's real commitment remained at home. Career ambition beyond a certain point could still be read as suspiciously unfeminine. A competent woman was welcome. An ambitious one was more complicated. Even language revealed the hierarchy. A man had a career. A woman often had a job, something temporary, supplementary, or politely secondary. Her work could be praised as admirable as long as it did not appear to compete with motherhood. Success was safest when it remained self-sacrificing. Yet beneath these limits, momentum was building. Quietly, thousands of individual decisions were reshaping the suburban landscape. A woman who enrolled in evening classes. A mother who refused to abandon professional identity after children. A wife who insisted that her husband learn domestic responsibility rather than treating the house as invisible labor. A daughter who looked at her mother's life and decided she wanted something different. These choices rarely looked historic in the moment. They looked like family disagreements, awkward conversations, practical compromises. But history often moves through precisely those ordinary negotiations. The suburb, built to stabilize post-war life, was becoming a place where stability itself had to be redefined. The polished certainty of the 1950s had depended on fixed roles. As those roles loosened, the house did not collapse, but its emotional architecture changed. Marriage became less obviously hierarchical. Parenthood became less clearly scripted. Domestic life became less able to pretend it existed outside politics. And politics, increasingly, was arriving right at the front door. Television brought civil rights protests, Cold War fear, and national crisis into the living room. Children asked questions parents had hoped to postpone. Women read arguments that made private frustration feel historically legible. Men confronted the possibility that authority without emotional partnership no longer looked like strength. The suburb could no longer preserve itself simply by trimming hedges and maintaining appearances. This is where the famous calm of suburban life begins to reveal another truth. It was often maintained by silence, and silence becomes difficult to preserve once enough people realize they are not alone in what they have been quietly feeling. A woman dissatisfied with confinement, a teenager skeptical of inherited rules, a black family excluded from the same dream, a husband unsure whether provision alone counted as love. These were not isolated problems. They were connected pressures inside the same system. And perhaps nowhere did those pressures become more visible than in the growing cracks around race and neighborhood belonging, because once the suburb had to answer who was allowed to live there, its carefully polite language about family values and community standards could no longer hide how much of its order had always depended on exclusion. This was one of the most uncomfortable truths beneath the bright image of post-war prosperity. The suburb was often presented as the natural destination of hard work and responsible citizenship, but in reality, access to that destination was heavily shaped by rules that were neither neutral nor accidental. The peaceful street, the good school, the rising home value, the reassuring sameness of the neighborhood, these things were often protected not simply by private preference, but by systems deliberately designed to separate people. Many Americans in the 1950s did not experience this as active cruelty. That, in some ways, made it more powerful. Exclusion was frequently disguised as normal procedure. Mortgage applications, lending standards, zoning laws, homeowners associations, real estate steering, restrictive covenants, and neighborhood reputation all worked together to create boundaries that could appear administrative rather than moral. A family could say they were simply protecting property values while participating in something much larger and harsher. The Federal Housing Administration and other lending structures helped make suburban homeownership possible for millions, but those opportunities were distributed unevenly from the beginning. In many cases, Black families found themselves denied access to the same favorable loans that helped white families build wealth through homeownership. Entire neighborhoods were treated as financially risky because of race, regardless of the actual people living there. This practice, later widely recognized as redlining, was not a side issue. It shaped the geography of opportunity itself. The result was profound. A suburban house was not only shelter. It was inheritance. It was access to better-funded schools, safer infrastructure, cleaner streets, stronger political influence, and the slow accumulation of family wealth across generations. To exclude people from that system was not simply to deny them a pleasant lawn. It was to redirect the future. And because suburban stability was tied so closely to the language of family, exclusion could be framed as responsibility. Parents claimed they were protecting children. Neighbors claimed they were preserving standards. Developers claimed they were maintaining harmony. Very few people needed to describe themselves as defenders of segregation for segregation to continue functioning. The suburb became a place where moral choices could be hidden inside polite domestic vocabulary. A white family moving into a new suburban development might genuinely believe they were simply pursuing a better life. In many cases, they wanted quieter streets, safer schools, less crowding, and a house their parents could never afford. But historical understanding requires holding two truths at once. Their comfort could be sincere, and the system producing that comfort could still be profoundly unjust. Nostalgia becomes dangerous when it allows one truth to erase the other. This tension surfaced most clearly when integration became visible rather than theoretical. A family living comfortably within a racially exclusive neighborhood could describe themselves as tolerant in principle. But when a Black family actually moved onto the street or tried to, abstract values became immediate tests. Suddenly, the issue was no longer national politics. It was the house next door. The reactions varied. Some people welcomed change. Some remained quietly supportive while avoiding public conflict. Others resisted fiercely, sometimes through open hostility, sometimes through quieter forms of obstruction that were easier to defend socially. A family might claim concern about schools, traffic, neighborhood character, or market stability. The language sounded practical, but the emotional charge underneath it often told a clearer story. Children watched these moments closely. They learned how prejudice could be spoken without being named. They learned that adults who described themselves as decent could still draw sharp boundaries around belonging. They learned that morality and politeness were not always the same thing. In many suburban homes, race was discussed not through explicit declarations, but through tone, warning, hesitation, and coded phrases. Schools became one of the most contested arenas because schools translated neighborhood boundaries into future opportunity. Parents who opposed integration often framed their objections around educational quality rather than race itself. Again, this mattered because it made exclusion feel respectable. The argument was rarely, "We do not want these people here." It was, "We are thinking of our children." Yet whose children counted, and whose futures were treated as negotiable, revealed the deeper structure. The civil rights movement made these contradictions increasingly difficult to ignore. Television brought images of protest, police violence, legal battles, and public courage into suburban living rooms. The suburb could no longer imagine itself entirely separate from the moral questions unfolding across the country. A father commuting from a quiet neighborhood might return home to news showing students attacked for trying to enter schools. A mother arranging dinner might watch demonstrations challenging the very assumptions that had shaped her neighborhood's safety. Some suburban residents responded defensively, insisting politics was invading private life. But private life had always been political. The neighborhood itself was political. The mortgage was political. The school district was political. The suburb only felt apolitical because its structure aligned so closely with the interests of those already comfortable inside it. This realization unsettled people because it forced a different question. Was suburban peace actually peace, or was it order purchased through selective invisibility? If calm required certain families to be kept elsewhere, if rising property values depended on exclusion, if stability meant refusing to confront inequality, then the moral innocence of the suburban dream became harder to sustain. There was also a generational dimension to this shift. Younger people, especially those coming of age in the early 1960s, often encountered race differently than their parents had. Schools, television, universities, music, and the broader energy of cultural change exposed them to ideas that made inherited suburban assumptions feel less natural. Not always, and certainly not universally, but enough to create tension. A teenager asking why a certain family was unwelcome could unsettle an entire dinner table more effectively than a newspaper editorial. For some white suburban families, civil rights became the first issue that made them realize their domestic comfort was linked to national moral questions. For black families, of course, this had never been hidden. The suburb represented not simply aesthetic preference, but a gate kept closed. Access to suburban life was part of the larger struggle for citizenship in practical form. It is important not to flatten all suburbs into one story. There were regional differences, economic differences, and genuine diversity of experience. Some communities integrated earlier or more peacefully. Some families resisted exclusion from the beginning. Others clung to it with extraordinary determination. But the larger pattern remains. The post-war suburban ideal was built in ways that made racial separation feel normal, even desirable, while presenting that separation as mere common sense. And race was not the only boundary being defended. Religion, ethnicity, and class also shaped belonging. Catholic families, Jewish families, immigrant households, and working-class newcomers could all encounter subtler versions of the same question. Do you fit the neighborhood's idea of respectability? Some barriers softened over time. Others remained stubbornly visible. The suburb was not simply a geographic space. It was a social filter. This filtering shaped architecture itself. Zoning laws that limited apartment buildings and protected single-family homes were often described as preserving neighborhood quality. In practice, they also limited who could afford to enter. A detached house on a large lot was not just a design preference. It was an economic boundary disguised as taste. The suburban landscape looked calm partly because it had been carefully engineered to produce a certain kind of population. Even shopping centers reflected this. The suburban mall, the grocery store, the carefully planned commercial strip, these were designed around assumptions about who the customer was supposed to be. Consumption became part of belonging. To shop correctly, dress correctly, host correctly, and maintain the right kind of domestic environment was to participate in suburban legitimacy. Difference that could not be smoothed into consumer respectability remained harder to absorb. And yet, despite all this control, the suburb could not remain sealed forever. Highways connected it to cities. Universities pulled children outward. Television dissolved local isolation. National crises entered the living room. The idea that one could preserve a morally tidy domestic world by arranging houses at the right distance from one another began to look increasingly fragile. There was something almost tragic in that fragility. Many suburban residents were not trying to be villains. They were trying to protect what they understood as a good life. Safety, continuity, the hope that children would do better than parents had done. But history becomes complicated precisely because good intentions can live inside harmful systems. People defended stability without always asking stability for whom. That question, stability for whom, would become sharper as the decade advanced. It would shape fights over busing, school funding, public investment, policing, and the meaning of citizenship itself. But even before those later conflicts became fully visible, the emotional climate of suburbia was already changing. Once people understood that the neighborhood was not simply natural, but constructed, they began looking at other parts of suburban life differently too. If race and class had been quietly built into the neighborhood's foundations, what else had been treated as natural simply because it was familiar? Marriage, gender roles, childhood discipline, sexual morality, even the architecture of the home itself, all of it became newly open to inspection. The suburb had once presented itself as the end of history, a final settled form of ordinary life. Now it looked more like an arrangement made by human choices, and therefore vulnerable to challenge. That shift in perspective mattered enormously. When people stop seeing a system as inevitable, they begin imagining alternatives. A wife begins asking whether domestic sacrifice is truly the only respectable life. A teenager questions whether adulthood must look like the exhausted calm of his father's commute. A black family refuses to accept exclusion as permanent. A neighborhood meeting about one new family becomes an argument about the entire moral story of the place. The lawns still looked perfect. The dinner parties still happened. The children still rode bicycles beneath evening streetlights. But underneath the surface, certainty was thinning. The suburb was learning that order maintained by silence could survive only as long as nobody insisted on describing what the silence had been protecting. And as more people began to describe it, another quiet transformation followed, because the emotional center of suburban life, especially for the children growing up inside it, was about to be reshaped by something that seemed at first almost harmless. The expanding world of television, advertising, and the powerful new machinery of wanting. Because once television entered the center of suburban life, it did more than entertain. It reorganized desire. It changed how families imagined success, how children measured normality, how women judged their homes, how men judged their status, and how entire neighborhoods learned to compare themselves against an increasingly polished national image of what life was supposed to look like. The television set itself was one of the great symbols of post-war domestic achievement. It sat in the living room not merely as an appliance, but almost as a declaration that the family had entered modern life properly. By the late 1950s, television was no longer a luxury reserved for a few. It had become a central object around which evenings were arranged. Furniture shifted toward it. Conversation adjusted around it. Children absorbed its rhythms. Advertisers understood quickly that if they could reach the living room, they could reach the emotional heart of the suburban household. And the message arriving through that screen was remarkably consistent. Happiness looked purchasable. The home was never finished. There was always a better refrigerator, a cleaner kitchen floor, a newer sofa, a shinier car, a brighter detergent, a more elegant dining set, a more modern bathroom, a more efficient vacuum, a better lawn mower, a more impressive holiday meal. Consumption was not presented as greed. It was presented as care. A good mother improved the home. A good father provided visible progress. A good family moved steadily upward through objects. This mattered because suburbia had already linked morality to appearance. Television simply intensified the standard and nationalized it. Your neighbors were no longer the only people you compared yourself to. Now there was an entire broadcast culture offering an endless parade of better kitchens, cleaner children, more effortless wives, more confident husbands, and families whose domestic life seemed permanently lit by the right kind of lamp. Of course, these images were often artificial, but artificial images can still shape real emotions. A woman standing in her own kitchen, tired and irritated, could feel she was failing not because her life was objectively difficult, but because the culture around her insisted domestic perfection should look easy. A husband watching advertisements for success and control could feel quietly inadequate even while doing everything expected of him. Children learned early that normal life was supposed to have a certain shine. This created a peculiar psychological pressure. Gratitude mixed with insufficiency. Families had more comfort than previous generations in many obvious ways, and they were reminded of that constantly. Yet the same culture that celebrated abundance also made abundance feel perpetually incomplete. There was always another step toward the ideal version of the suburban self. This is part of what made the decade feel both prosperous and strangely restless. Consumption did not simply satisfy desire. It trained desire to remain active. The suburban house became a project without a final state. A family could own a home and still feel behind. They could have safety and still experience status anxiety. Progress became less a destination than a permanent maintenance of visible adequacy. Children absorbed this especially quickly because childhood itself was becoming more closely tied to consumer identity. Toys, clothing, lunchboxes, birthday parties, bicycles, records, and later teenage fashion all became ways of locating oneself socially. Belonging was increasingly expressed through ownership. To be left out of a trend was not merely inconvenient. It could feel like exclusion from normal life itself. Parents, naturally, felt the pressure. A father who had grown up during economic hardship might look at these expectations with both pride and unease. He wanted his children to have more than he had, but more was becoming difficult to define. Was it safety, education, character? Or was it the right television, the right Christmas gifts, the right suburban evidence that one's family was keeping pace? Consumer culture blurred those lines until love and purchasing could begin to feel emotionally entangled. Mothers carried much of this burden because the home remained the primary stage on which family success was judged. Advertising often addressed women directly, not simply as shoppers but as moral custodians of domestic atmosphere. If the laundry was not white enough, if the floor was not shining enough, if dinner was not inviting enough, the implication was rarely practical. It was emotional. A properly managed home signaled competence, devotion, and feminine worth. There was something quietly ruthless in this logic. It transformed ordinary imperfection into personal failure. The child with grass stains, the cluttered living room, the fatigue visible on a woman's face after a long day. These could all feel like moral evidence in a culture that treated domestic presentation as character. And because suburbia was so visible, because neighbors could see the yard, the curtains, the children leaving for school, these pressures did not remain abstract. Even leisure became commercialized. Family happiness was increasingly pictured through purchased experiences. The barbecue grill, the station wagon vacation, the backyard patio set, the birthday party arranged with magazine precision. Relaxation itself had to be performed correctly. The weekend was no longer simply free time. It was another opportunity to demonstrate competent prosperity. This helps explain why suburban life could feel curiously exhausting despite its conveniences. The appliances saved labor, but they also raised standards. The television offered relaxation, but it also imported judgment. The shopping center provided comfort, but it also turned identity into a public marketplace. Modern abundance solved certain hardships while creating subtler emotional disciplines. Teenagers were especially sensitive to this because adolescence is often where people first learn the social meaning of possession. The right shoes, the right jacket, the right record collection, the right car, or the absence of one, could shape social belonging with startling force. The suburb, with its visible sameness and competitive normality, made small differences feel enormous. A teenager did not need to be poor to feel excluded. They only needed to feel slightly behind the standard everyone else seemed to be meeting. Cars, in particular, became symbols of freedom and adulthood. For suburban teenagers, the automobile represented escape from the supervised geography of home. It meant privacy, movement, status, and possibility. But it also reflected class and parental expectation. Which car, who was allowed to drive, where one could go, these were not trivial details. They were negotiations about independence and control. The driveway itself became part of family politics. The same was true of dating. Romance in suburbia unfolded under the watchful structure of reputation and visibility. Who picked whom up, which family approved, where the date happened, how late someone returned home, these things carried social meaning. Television and popular culture expanded fantasies of glamour and romance, while the neighborhood continued enforcing older standards of respectability. Teenagers often lived in the gap between those two worlds. This gap produced a particular kind of frustration. The culture invited desire while regulating its expression. It sold excitement while demanding restraint. It promised individuality through products while maintaining strong expectations of conformity. Many young people learned early that self-expression was welcome only when it remained legible to suburban approval. And yet, consumer culture also made resistance possible. Music, fashion, and style gave teenagers languages their parents had not fully designed. A haircut, a record, a jacket, a refusal to perform cheerful normality. These could become small acts of independence. The suburb that tried to organize life through appearance also made appearance one of the easiest places to challenge authority. Television played an equally strange role in shaping race and class awareness. On one hand, it often reinforced white middle-class domestic norms as the national standard. On the other hand, it brought distant realities into suburban homes. News coverage of civil rights protests, urban poverty, political violence, and cultural change made it harder to believe the suburb was the whole country. Children who watched those images could begin to question why their own streets looked so separate from the wider American story. The screen, in that sense, became both a tool of conformity and a crack in it. It sold the dream and exposed its limits at the same time. Adults were not immune to this contradiction. Many suburban fathers who worked long hours to maintain the household found themselves increasingly aware that the household was now judged by standards they did not control. Many mothers who tried to create warmth and beauty at home were confronted daily by media images implying there was always a better version of domestic life just beyond reach. Prosperity became a race against a moving target. This also shaped friendships and neighborly relations. Entertaining became subtly competitive. Whose dinner parties were admired, whose children were best behaved, whose holidays looked most successful, whose husband had been promoted, whose wife seemed effortlessly put together. These were rarely spoken aloud, but they structured emotional life. Envy in suburbia often wore the polite face of admiration. The famous cocktail party of the era captures this perfectly. It looked relaxed, modern, sophisticated. Adults laughed in living rooms, glasses in hand, children asleep upstairs. But beneath the ease there could be enormous strain. Financial comparison, marital performance, gender expectation, sexual tension, and the quiet relief of alcohol smoothing over what nobody intended to say plainly. The party was not false, exactly. People did enjoy themselves. But enjoyment and performance were often inseparable. This is why the dark side of suburbia is best understood not as secret horror, but as a system of ordinary pressures so normalized they could pass for common sense. No single moment looked dramatic enough to demand revolt. Instead, people accumulated fatigue. They adjusted. They joked. They drank. They bought better curtains. They disciplined children. They compared themselves to neighbors. They told themselves this was simply adulthood. But history changes when enough people begin suspecting that adulthood should not feel like permanent quiet compromise. By the early 1960s, that suspicion was spreading. It moved through magazine articles, college campuses, civil rights activism, neighborhood disputes, and private conversations at kitchen tables after children had gone to bed. It moved through daughters watching mothers and deciding they wanted a different script. It moved through sons who looked at the commuter train and wondered whether that was the full shape of manhood. It moved through families confronting the moral discomfort of exclusion they had once called normal. And perhaps most significantly, it moved through the realization that the suburban dream had taught people to confuse appearance with truth. A beautiful street could still contain loneliness. A good school district could still rest on injustice. A stable marriage could still hold silence. A modern home could still feel like a carefully decorated form of captivity. Once people saw that clearly, they could not entirely unsee it. The television kept glowing. The advertisements kept promising. The lawns remained trimmed. But underneath, a quieter revolution was already underway, one that would soon turn the suburban household itself into one of the central battlegrounds of the 1960s, where questions about authority, freedom, gender, race, and the meaning of the American dream would stop being background tension and become impossible to keep politely off the living room sofa. Because once those questions reached the living room sofa, suburbia could no longer pretend that history was happening somewhere else. For a long time, the suburban ideal had depended on a kind of geographical optimism, the belief that distance itself could create moral clarity. Move away from the crowded city, away from visible poverty, away from industrial grime, away from political tension, and a better life would emerge almost naturally. The detached house on the quiet street suggested that social problems belonged elsewhere. The suburb was meant to feel like an answer. But the 1960s had a way of entering every room. Through television, through children returning from school or university with new arguments, through newspapers folded beside the breakfast table, through the simple fact that national conflicts were increasingly impossible to isolate from private life, the suburb discovered that no amount of lawn care could keep history politely outside. Civil rights was one of the first forces to make that impossible. It was no longer a distant Southern issue for many white suburban families. Questions about school integration, fair housing, voting rights, and public morality arrived directly at the level of neighborhood identity. A father who believed himself decent might now have to explain why he opposed a black family moving nearby. A mother who saw herself as compassionate might have to confront the fact that the good school she defended depended on lines others were not allowed to cross. This was rarely discussed in grand language at first. It appeared in parent meetings, church conversations, whispers after real estate signs went up, nervous conversations about changing neighborhoods, and quiet decisions about where not to move. Respectable suburbia often preferred euphemism to confession. People said, standards, stability, the children, the future of the community. Yet the moral substance beneath those words became increasingly visible. Some suburban churches became sites of genuine reckoning. Clergy and congregations were forced to ask whether Christian respectability meant maintaining social peace or confronting injustice. For some families, Sunday sermons about justice and dignity created difficult conversations at lunch tables where inherited prejudices had long gone unchallenged. Faith, which had once reinforced suburban order, could begin to destabilize it. Schools became even sharper battlegrounds because children were involved. Few things provoke parental intensity like the belief that a child's future is being threatened. And in suburbia, the school was not merely educational. It was part of the property value, the neighborhood's reputation, and the moral story families told themselves about why they had moved there in the first place. A challenge to the school system felt like a challenge to the entire suburban bargain. At the same time, a different revolution was happening inside the same homes. The slow unraveling of unquestioned gender roles. Women who had spent years translating dissatisfaction into private endurance were now encountering a broader language for what they had felt. It came through books, conversations, university courses, workplace experience, and the simple relief of discovering that loneliness inside domestic abundance was not a personal defect but a shared condition. This did not mean every woman suddenly wanted the same future. Many still loved the home, loved motherhood, loved domestic life itself. The shift was subtler and more profound, the right to define fulfillment rather than inherit it. That shift could be explosive inside marriage because marriages had often been built on assumptions that no longer felt permanent. A husband might still believe he was offering devotion through provision, while his wife was asking for partnership rather than protection. A wife seeking work, education, or autonomy could be heard as rejecting the family rather than asking to exist more fully within it. Ordinary conversations about schedules, money, childcare, and ambition could carry the emotional force of an entire cultural transition. Many men felt genuinely disoriented by this. Their own identity had been organized around a role that now seemed less stable. If authority alone no longer defined adulthood, what replaced it? If emotional partnership mattered more than simple provision, then many men were being asked to develop forms of intimacy they had never been taught to practice. Some adapted with grace. Others reacted with resentment, confusion, or withdrawal. Most moved somewhere in between. Children, again, became witnesses. They saw mothers who were less willing to disappear into cheerful service. They saw fathers uncertain whether firmness still counted as love. They watched marriages renegotiate themselves in real time. For a generation growing up in the 1960s, adulthood no longer looked like a settled script but like an argument still being written. Teenagers were already pushing at those boundaries in their own ways. The suburban child of the early 1960s lived in a world shaped by extraordinary contradiction. They were told to respect authority in a culture increasingly suspicious of it. They were raised inside comfort while watching televised images of violence, protest, and moral urgency. They were promised freedom through prosperity while sensing how rigidly ordinary life had been designed for them. College, for those who reached it, often intensified this transformation. A student raised in a carefully managed suburban environment could encounter intellectual, political, and emotional worlds that made home feel newly strange. Returning for holidays, they might see their parents' neighborhood with different eyes. The sameness of the houses, the quiet racial boundaries, the rituals of polite competition, the marriages held together by habit and caution. What once looked like normal life could begin to feel like a performance everyone had agreed not to interrupt. This created one of the most familiar emotional scenes of the decade: the dinner table argument between generations. Sometimes it was about war, sometimes race, sometimes religion, sexuality, women's roles, or simply the suspicion that adulthood should mean more than repeating the same suburban script. Parents often experienced this as ingratitude. Children often experienced it as moral clarity. Both were usually carrying more fear than either side admitted. The Vietnam era would deepen these fractures even further, but even before that conflict fully defined suburban households, the emotional structure of authority was already changing. Fathers who had once embodied unquestioned competence were now being challenged by sons who believed obedience itself might be cowardice. Mothers who had spent years protecting domestic calm found themselves mediating conflicts that could no longer be solved by politeness. Suburbia was discovering that private order depended on public legitimacy. Once the outside world seemed morally unstable, the inside world lost some of its certainty too. Even architecture began to feel different under this pressure. The open-plan living room, once a symbol of modern transparency and family togetherness, could become a stage where nobody felt entirely private. The separate bedroom, once a quiet refuge, could become the site of marital distance. The backyard fence, once a pleasant boundary, could begin to resemble a small controlled world whose rules no longer felt self-evident. There is something revealing in how often suburban dissatisfaction appeared through jokes. Satire became one of the safest ways to tell uncomfortable truths. Cartoons about commuting fathers, tranquilized housewives, perfect lawns, fake smiles, nosy neighbors, and identical dinner parties were funny because they were recognizable. Humor allowed criticism without immediate rebellion. It let people admit that the dream was tiring before they were ready to abandon it. Popular culture reflected this growing discomfort. Films, novels, and journalism increasingly treated suburban life not as unquestioned success, but as a place of hidden frustration, secrecy, and emotional compression. The same neighborhoods once sold as the future could now be portrayed as strangely airless. Again, this did not mean the suburb was collapsing. It meant the moral certainty around it was weakening. And that weakening had economic consequences too. Consumer prosperity depended on confidence in the suburban family model. If marriage, gender roles, and social trust became less predictable, then the entire machine of post-war domestic marketing looked less stable. Advertisers adjusted, politics adjusted, but the emotional transition was slower. People were still living inside houses built for one vision of life while increasingly imagining another. This is part of what makes the history of suburbia so compelling. It was never just about houses. It was about the attempt to design adulthood itself. The lawn, the commute, the school district, the dinner table, the church pew, the television set. Each was a piece of a larger argument about what a good life should be. The darker side emerged whenever lived reality refused to stay neatly inside that design. And often, lived reality refused quietly. A woman who no longer laughed at the right moments during neighborhood gatherings. A husband who stayed longer at work because home felt like another arena of expectation. A child who stopped believing the family's version of fairness. A family who moved in despite not fitting the old neighborhood assumptions. A teenager whose music, politics, or friendships made conformity impossible. None of these looked like revolutions on their own, but history rarely announces itself with a trumpet. More often, it arrives as repeated small refusals. There was also the growing visibility of divorce, though still far from its later normalization. Even the possibility of leaving a marriage carried symbolic weight. It suggested that permanence might not be the highest moral good if permanence required the permanent shrinking of the self. For some, divorce remained scandalous. For others, it became evidence that the old suburban promise of automatic domestic harmony had been too simplistic from the beginning. Women's increasing participation in public life, through work, activism, education, and political engagement, also altered the emotional center of the neighborhood. The suburban wife had once been imagined primarily as guardian of private order. Now she might be organizing civic action, attending classes, demanding legal rights, or asking why domestic labor remained invisible simply because it happened in a kitchen rather than an office. This was not a smooth liberation story. Many women felt guilt as much as freedom. Many men felt tenderness alongside defensiveness. Many families tried to preserve what was good in the old structure while loosening what had become intolerable. Real life is rarely ideological. It is made of compromises, contradictions, and people trying not to lose one another while changing. Still, by the mid-1960s, something fundamental had shifted. The suburb could no longer convincingly present itself as the quiet endpoint of American aspiration. It had become one of the places where the nation's deepest arguments were most visible. Race, gender, class, youth rebellion, moral authority, consumer identity, emotional honesty. None of these could be kept safely abstract when they were happening in the kitchen. And perhaps the most unsettling realization for many families was that the suburb had not failed because it was entirely false. It had failed, or at least become unstable, because it was only partially true. Security mattered. Home mattered. Children mattered. Community mattered. The tragedy was that these real human needs had been tied to a system that too often demanded silence, exclusion, and emotional self-erasure as the price of belonging. Once that price became visible, the dream itself changed. The streetlights still came on in the evening. Lawns still had to be cut. Dinner still had to be made. Children still rode bicycles in circles at dusk. But now those same ordinary scenes carried a different emotional weight, because the people inside them were beginning to ask not just how to keep the neighborhood beautiful, but whether beauty without honesty had ever really been peace at all. And as that question settled into suburban life, another force was rising alongside it. One that would make the private anxieties of the household collide directly with national fear. The Cold War itself, and the strange reality of building cheerful family life under the permanent shadow of possible nuclear destruction. And perhaps that is where the deepest truth of 1950s suburbia finally reveals itself. The bright lawn and the bomb shelter belonged to the same world. The post-war suburb was built as a promise of safety. It offered distance from urban noise, from wartime scarcity, from the visible instability of earlier decades. It was meant to feel permanent. A house with a mortgage, children in good schools, neighbors who waved politely across trimmed hedges. This was supposed to be the architecture of reassurance. Yet all of it unfolded beneath the strange psychological ceiling of the Cold War, where ordinary domestic life existed alongside the knowledge that everything could disappear in an afternoon. Families practiced duck and cover drills. School children were taught to hide beneath desks as though wood and discipline might protect them from the unimaginable. Some homes discussed fallout shelters with the same practical tone used for kitchen renovations. Newspapers moved easily between appliance advertisements and nuclear anxiety. The suburb became a place where cheerful normality and existential fear lived side by side. This matters because it helps explain why so much of suburban life felt so intensely controlled. Order was not simply aesthetic. It was emotional defense. If the wider world felt unstable, if war, ideology, civil rights conflict, and social transformation threatened certainty, then the home became even more symbolically important. The polished kitchen, the family dinner, the good manners, the quiet street. These were not just habits. They were rituals of reassurance. But reassurance built entirely on control is fragile. The darker side of suburbia was never just hidden misery behind perfect curtains. It was the quieter realization that the dream itself asked for too much silence. It asked women to turn confinement into gratitude. It asked men to translate exhaustion into authority. It asked children to inherit certainty while sensing the adults around them were often improvising it. It asked black families and many others to accept exclusion so that someone else's neighborhood could remain calm. It asked entire communities to confuse appearance with virtue. And still, many people loved those homes. That is what makes the history worth understanding rather than simplifying. The suburb was not a fraud. It gave millions of families real comfort, privacy, dignity, and hope. Children did remember safe streets, bicycles at dusk, television light in the evening, mothers calling them home for dinner, fathers returning from work with the smell of train stations and office buildings still on their coats. These memories are not false. They are simply incomplete. Because alongside that comfort were marriages held together by duty more than intimacy. Women swallowing loneliness because no respectable language existed for it. Men discovering that provision alone did not answer the question of who they were. Teenagers staring at the polished future prepared for them and wondering if adulthood had to feel so narrow. Neighbors protecting community standards without naming what those standards excluded. Families performing happiness because the culture had made performance feel like morality. The suburb was a machine for producing belonging, but belonging came with terms. As the 1960s moved forward, those terms became harder to accept without question. Women demanded fuller lives. Civil rights exposed the moral cost of selective peace. Younger generations challenged authority that no longer seemed naturally legitimate. The living room itself became political. The dinner table became a place where the nation argued with itself. And that may be the most important historical lesson here. The American dream was never only about owning a house. It was about deciding what kind of life that house was meant to protect. Was it obedience or freedom? Respectability or honesty? Safety for some or dignity for all? Was family a shelter, or could it become a beautiful form of confinement? Was success the appearance of stability, or the courage to admit when stability had been built on silence? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They lived in kitchens, bedrooms, school meetings, mortgage papers, and Sunday afternoons. They lived in who got invited to the neighborhood barbecue and who never had the chance to buy the house next door. They lived in a wife looking out the window after the children had gone to school, wondering why gratitude and emptiness could coexist so easily. They lived in a husband sitting in his parked car for an extra 5 minutes before walking inside, trying to gather enough calm to continue performing certainty. History often survives in exactly those small moments. When people look back at 1950s suburbia now, they often see either pure nostalgia or pure criticism. But the truth is quieter, and therefore more human. It was a world of genuine aspiration shaped by genuine limitation. It offered comfort and demanded conformity. It gave security and quietly rationed freedom. It created stability, but often by asking certain people to disappear inside the story of it. That is why it still feels familiar, because even now, many people still live inside versions of the same bargain. The hope that if life looks right enough from the outside, peace will eventually arrive on the inside. The suburb reminds us that appearance can never fully solve the deeper work of building a meaningful life. A clean street is not justice. A beautiful home is not intimacy. A quiet neighborhood is not always peace. Sometimes the most unsettling histories are not the loud ones, but the ones that look almost ordinary. A driveway, a television glowing in the evening, a mother drying dishes, a father reading the paper, children laughing somewhere beyond the hedge, everything appearing exactly as it should, and underneath it all the questions nobody was supposed to ask. That, perhaps, was the real dark side of 1950s suburbia. Not that the dream was false, but that it was real enough to be loved, and flawed enough to leave so many people quietly lonely inside it. If one detail from that world surprised you most, I'd love to hear it. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the hidden corners of history, stay with me. There are always more ordinary places from the past that turn out, on closer inspection, to be far stranger than they first appear.